Senior Chief Daniel Vickers grabbed the medical bag off Cass Morgan's shoulder and threw it into the dirt at her feet. You want to play soldier doc, then go home and let real operators do the fighting. The whole team went quiet. Cass didn't flinch. She didn't argue. She just knelt down, picked up her bag, and looked at him with eyes so calm it unsettled every man in the yard. What none of them knew, what none of them would learn until the ridge lit up with machine gun fire, was that this quiet woman had been trained since childhood to do the one thing they thought only they could do. Before we go further, if you love stories about the underestimated, the overlooked, and the quiet ones who turn out to be the strongest in the room, take a second right now to subscribe to the channel and stay with me all the way to the end. And do me one small favor, leave a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Firebase Anchor sat at the top of a mountain that God seemed to have forgotten. The men who lived there called it the edge of the map, the last outpost before nothing. And on the morning Cass Morgan first walked through the gate, she already understood one thing about the place. Nobody here wanted her. She had heard it before she even set her boots on the ground. A voice carried down from the guard post loud enough that it was meant to be heard. They sent us a nurse. Somebody laughed. Somebody always laughed. Cass didn't slow her step. She adjusted the strap on her shoulder and kept walking past the sandbags, past the men who stopped their work just to stare at her, like she was something that had wandered in from the wrong world. She was home. She was quiet. She didn't carry herself the way they expected. And to men who measured worth by the width of a chest and the volume of a voice that made her invisible before she'd even said a word, Senior Chief Daniel Vickers was waiting for her outside the operations tent. He was a mountain of a man, gray at the temples, with the kind of face that had stopped smiling somewhere around his third deployment. He looked her up and down slow, the way a man looks at a delivery he didn't order. "You're the corpsman," he said. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. "Dr. Cass Morgan," she answered, reporting in. "Doctor." He said the word like it tasted bad. "We don't need a doctor. We need a medic who knows how to stay out of the way. You think you can do that?" "I can do whatever the mission needs, Senior Chief." He leaned in a little closer. "The mission needs you behind the wire, patching up men when they come back. That's it. You don't go out. You don't touch a weapon unless the base is falling. And you sure as hell don't tell me or my men how to do our jobs. You understand me?" Cass held his stare. Most people looked away from Vickers. She didn't. "I understand you perfectly," she said. And that was the thing that would stay with him later after everything. She didn't argue. She didn't get flustered. She just filed his words away somewhere behind those quiet eyes, like she was cataloging him. Like she was learning him. He didn't like it. He couldn't have said, "Wait, get your gear stowed," he grunted, turning away. "And Doc, stay behind the wire. Leave the combat to the real operators." There it was, the line he would repeat a dozen times over the coming days. The line half the base would adopt like a slogan. Real operators, as if it were a title you earned by being loud enough. As if courage came in only one shape. Cass picked up her bag and walked toward the medical tent without another word. What Vickers didn't know, what none of them knew, was who had raised her. Her grandfather had been a Marine Scout sniper, a man who spoke in half sentences and taught in silences. He'd taken her in when she was 7 years old after her parents were gone, and he had raised her the only way he knew how. Not with toys, with patience, not with games, with rifles. By the time she was 10, she could name the wind by the way it bent the grass. By 12, she could hold a position for hours without moving, breathing so slow you'd think she was sleeping. By 15, she could put a round through a target at distances that would make grown men shake their heads and call it luck. Her grandfather never called it luck. He called it discipline. He called it the reward for being the person who watches while everyone else talks. "The battlefield tells you everything, Cassie," he used to say, his voice low and rough as gravel. "But only if you're quiet enough to hear it. Loud men die. Watchful ones live. Be the one who watches." He'd been dead 6 years now, but she still heard his voice every single day, and she was still the one who watched. That first night at Firebase Anchor, while the operators played cards and swapped war stories and laughed too loud in the mess tent, Cass sat alone at the edge of the base and studied the valley. She wasn't idle. She was never idle. She watched the way the light died on the western ridge. She noted where the shadows pooled first, which meant which slopes faced away from the sun, which meant where a man might hide and stay cool through the day. She counted the folds in the terrain. She marked the two draws that fed into the valley floor like the mouths of rivers. She watched a hawk ride the thermals rising off the eastern face, and she learned just from that bird where the warm air climbed and where it fell. Nobody taught her to do this. Nobody had to. It was as natural to her as breathing. While the operators saw a valley, Cass saw a chessboard, and she was already quietly learning every square. A young SEAL named Jonah Pike found her out there. He was the youngest on the team, barely 23, still soft around the certainty that older men wore like armor. He'd been sent to bring her a radio check schedule, and he stopped a few feet away when he saw her sitting so still, staring out at the darkening valley. "Doc," he said, "you good?" "I'm fine, Pike." He glanced out at the valley, trying to see whatever she was seeing. He saw nothing but rocks in the coming dark. "What are you looking at out there?" Cass didn't turn around. "That eastern ridge, the high point about 800 meters out." "What about it?" "If someone wanted to hit this base," she said quietly, "that's where they'd put their gun. Perfect elevation, perfect angle. The morning sun would be behind them, right in our eyes. And there's a draw just below it where a squad could move up under cover, and nobody on the wall would ever see them coming until they were already inside 300 meters. Jonah frowned. He looked at the ridge. He looked at her. Then he looked at the ridge again, and something cold moved down his spine, because now that she'd said it, he could see it too. She was right. Of course she was right. "How do you know that?" he asked. Cass finally turned and looked at him, and there was no arrogance in her face. Just a quiet, tired certainty. "Because I was taught to know it," she said. "A long time before I ever picked up a medical bag." Jonah didn't know what to say to that, so he handed her the radio schedule and walked away. But he didn't forget it. In the days that followed, when the others were mocking the doctor and laughing behind her back, Jonah Pike found himself watching her instead. And the more he watched, the more he noticed things. The way she never wasted a movement. The way her eyes were always working, always cataloging, always 3 steps ahead. The way she went still under pressure while other men got loud. He couldn't have put it into words yet, but some part of him understood before anyone else did that they had all made a mistake about this woman. A dangerous one. The days at Firebase Anchor settled into a rhythm, and that rhythm had no place for Cass Morgan in it. Every morning the patrols went out, and every morning Cass was left behind. Lieutenant Caleb Mercer, the officer in charge, made sure of it. He wasn't cruel the way Vickers was cruel. Mercer was worse in his own way because he was polite about it. He'd smile as careful officers smile and say things like, "We need our medic fresh, Doc. Can't have you worn down from the field." And everyone would nod like it made sense. And Cass would be left standing at the gate watching the men walk out into the country she understood better than any of them. She never complained. Not once. But she watched. "You ever wonder why she doesn't fight it?" One of the operators, a wiry man named Ruiz, asked in the mess tent one evening. "I mean, if I got treated like that, I'd be raising hell." Vickers snorted from across the table. "Because she knows her place. Smartest thing about her." A few men laughed, but Jonah Pike, sitting at the end of the table, didn't laugh. He'd been watching Cass through the open flap of the tent. She was out there in the dying light again, sitting on an ammunition crate, a small notebook open on her knee, sketching something. "What's she writing?" Jonah wondered aloud. "Love letters," someone joked. "Or her resignation if we're lucky." But Jonah got up. He was the only one who ever did. He walked out to where she sat and looked over her shoulder before she could close the notebook. It wasn't love letters. It wasn't a resignation. It was the valley. Page after page, the entire terrain rendered in careful, precise pencil. Distances marked in meters, wind notations, elevations, little arrows showing how the air moved through the draws at different times of day, firing angles sketched in from every position on the base. It was a masterwork of observation, the kind of thing a professional would spend weeks assembling. And she'd done it in a handful of days alone from the edge of a base where everyone thought she was useless. "You made a range card," Jonah said slowly, "for the whole valley." Cass closed the notebook unhurried. "Habit. Doc, this is what a sniper does. This is exactly what a designated marksman would build before an engagement." "I know what it is," she said. Jonah crouched down beside her, his voice dropped low, careful like he was afraid of scaring off the truth. "Who are you, really?" For a long moment, she didn't answer. The wind moved across the mountain and carried the sound of the men laughing back in the tent. And then Cass said quietly, without any drama at all, "I'm the medic. That's all anybody here needs me to be." But her eyes went out to the eastern ridge again as she said it. The high point, 840 meters, she'd measured it now exactly. And Jonah understood that she wasn't answering his question. She was just telling him the answer everyone had already decided on. "They're wrong about you," he said, "aren't they?" Cass stood up, tucked the notebook into her jacket, and looked at him with something that was almost but not quite a smile. "It doesn't matter what people think you are, Pike," she said. "It only matters what you can do when the moment comes. And when it comes, nobody asks for your resume. They just ask for your help." She walked back toward the medical tent, and Jonah Pike stayed crouched in the dirt for a long time, staring at the eastern ridge, feeling the strange certain that he had just been given a warning about the future. He was right. He just didn't know how soon it would come. The humiliations didn't stop. If anything, they got worse, because a certain kind of man cannot stand a person who refuses to be provoked. Cass's calm was like a mirror, and the men who mocked her didn't like what they saw in it. It came to a head 3 days later in the yard in front of everyone. The team was gearing up for a patrol checking weapons when Vickers decided to make a point of her. He always did it in front of the others. That was how men like Vickers worked. Cruelty was a performance, and it needed an audience. "Morgan!" he barked. "Come here." Cass came. She always came when called. She stood in front of him, small and steady. Vickers held up his rifle. "You know what this is, Doc? A rifle, Senior Chief." "That's right. It's a rifle. It's the thing that keeps you alive out here. And you know why you'll never carry one?" He leaned in close so the whole yard could hear. "Because carrying this is a man's job. It takes nerve. It takes years of training. It takes something you don't have and never will. So you stick to your Band-Aids and your bandages, and you leave the rifle to the real operators. You copy." The yard had gone silent. Every man was watching. Some were grinning. Some looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Jonah Pike stood at the edge of the group with his fists clenched, wanting to say something and not brave enough yet to say it. And Cass just looked at the rifle in Vickers' hands. Her eyes moved over it once, quick and professional, the way a mechanic looks at an engine. "Senior Chief," she said quietly, "your optics canted about 2 degrees left, and your gas blocks carbon fouled. She'll start short stroking on you inside 100 rounds if you don't clean her tonight." The silence changed. It got heavier. Vickers looked down at his own rifle. His jaw tightened. Because she was right. He could see it now. The optics sat crooked, just barely, just enough. And he hadn't cleaned the gas system in days. "Lucky guess," he muttered, but his voice had lost something. "It wasn't a guess," Cass said. "Not sharp, not proud, just true. May I get back to work, Senior Chief?" He waved her off, red-faced, and she walked away, and behind her the yard buzzed with a low murmur of men who didn't quite know what they'd just seen. Jonah caught up with her by the medical tent. Doc, that was, how did you know that from 10 feet away?" Cass set down her bag. "My grandfather used to blindfold me and hand me a rifle in pieces," she said. "I had to assemble it by feel and tell him everything that was wrong with it before he'd let me eat. I was 9. She paused. "You learn to see a weapon after enough years, the way you learn to see a face." Jonah stared at her. "Your grandfather, who was he?" Cass was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Marine, scout sniper, 2 wars. He had more confirmed kills than anyone on this base has ever seen, and he never once raised his voice to prove it." She looked out at the ridge again. She was always looking at that ridge. "He taught me that the loudest man in the room is almost never the most dangerous one. The dangerous one is the person nobody's watching." She picked her bag back up. "Nobody's watching me, Pike. That's the only advantage I've ever needed." And Jonah Pike felt that cold feeling down his spine again, the one he was starting to know well. Because he was beginning to understand that everyone on this base had made the same mistake. They'd looked at a small, quiet woman and decided she was nothing. And they had no idea that the most lethal person at Firebase Anchor had been standing among them the whole time, patiently waiting for a moment nobody wanted to arrive. That night, the intelligence reports came in. Enemy movement in the valley, more than they'd seen before. Vehicles on the far roads after dark. Radio chatter picking up on frequencies they couldn't crack. Lieutenant Mercer stood over the map in the operations tent with Vickers and the senior operators, and the mood was tight. "They're massing for something," Mercer said. "Question is where and when." "We hit them first," Vickers said. "Big patrol at dawn, push into the valley, find them, break them up before they can organize." Mercer nodded slowly. "Full team, dawn." Cass Morgan was in the corner of the tent restocking a trauma kit, and she'd been listening to every word. She rarely spoke in these briefings. She wasn't invited to, but something made her set down the kit and step forward. "Lieutenant?" Every head turned. It was rare enough that she spoke that the silence came fast. "The doctor has an opinion," Vickers said dryly. "This should be good." Cass ignored him. She looked at Mercer. "If you're pushing a full patrol into the valley at dawn, you'll be moving up one of the two draws. The southern one is the easier route, so that's the one your point man will want to take. But that draw is a killing funnel. Steep walls, no cover in the middle, and the high ground on the eastern ridge looks straight down into it." Mercer frowned. And if they've been watching us, and they have, that's exactly where they'll want you. They'll let you walk into the draw. Then they'll open up from the eastern ridge with the sun behind them right in your eyes, and you won't be able to see the muzzle flashes to shoot back. Your men will be pinned in the open with no cover and no way to spot the shooters. She said it flatly without fear, the way you'd read a weather report. If you go up the southern draw at dawn, they'll cut you to pieces before you fire a shot. The tent was dead quiet. Then Vickers laughed. It was an ugly sound. "You hear this? The nurse is running tactical now. She read a map for a week, and she thinks she's got it figured out." He turned to Mercer. "Sir, respectfully, this is exactly the kind of nonsense that happens when you let people talk who shouldn't be in the room." Mercer hesitated, and in his hesitation, Cass saw the whole thing turn. She saw him weigh her word against Vickers's, and she saw which way the scale fell, because it always fell the same way. She was the medic. She was the woman. She was the one who stayed behind the wire. "Noted, Doc," Mercer said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "But we've been doing this a long time. We'll take the southern draw. It's the fastest route, and we'll have overwatch. Get back to your kit." Cass looked at him for a long moment. She didn't argue. She never argued. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. But as she turned to go back to her trauma kit, she caught Jonah Pike's eye across the tent, and she held it. And in that look, she said everything she couldn't say out loud. She was telling him, "Remember this. Remember what I said. Because tomorrow when it happens exactly the way I told you it would, someone is going to need to move fast, and I need at least one person here to already believe me." Jonah swallowed hard. He gave her the smallest nod. And Cass Morgan went back to her corner, and she packed her trauma kit fuller than she ever had before. Extra tourniquets, extra pressure dressings, more chest seals than a single patrol should ever need. She packed like a woman who already knew how the morning would end. She didn't sleep that night. She sat at the edge of the base one more time in the cold, and she looked at the eastern ridge in the dark, and she went through her grandfather's voice one more time. "The battlefield tells you everything, Cassie, but only if you're quiet enough to hear it." She'd heard it. She'd been hearing it for days. She'd tried to tell them. And they wouldn't listen because listening to her would have meant admitting she was more than they'd decided she was. So she checked her range card one last time. 840 meters to the high point on the eastern ridge. She'd measured it a dozen times now. She knew the wind at dawn. It fell down off the peak and swept left across the valley floor about 8 to 10 miles an hour, steady in the first hour of light. She knew the sun would clear the ridge at 6:40. She knew where the shadows would be. She knew if she'd been the enemy, exactly where she'd put every gun. She knew all of it, and she prayed quietly that she was wrong. She wasn't. Before dawn, the men gathered in the yard, and Cass stood at the gate the way she always did, left behind, the way she always was. Vickers walked past her, geared up, and he couldn't resist one last shot. "Keep the coffee warm, Doc," he said, grinning. "We'll be back in a few hours. Try not to get bored behind the wire." Cass didn't answer. She just looked at him with those calm, steady eyes. And for a fraction of a second, something crossed Vickers' face, the faintest flicker of a doubt he'd never admit to. Then it was gone, and he swaggered out the gate with the rest of them up toward the southern draw, exactly the way she'd told them not to go. Jonah Pike was the last one out. He stopped in front of her. "You really think it's going to happen?" And he said, "Like you said." "I hope I'm wrong, Pike." Her voice was very quiet. I have never in my life hoped so hard to be wrong. He looked at her. Then he did something none of the others would have done. He reached out and gripped her shoulder once firm. If it goes bad up there, he said, and they call for you, you come right. You don't wait for permission. Cass met his eyes. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Firebase Anchor, she let him see just a sliver of what was underneath the calm. Something old, something certain, something built by a hard old man on a hard old range a long, long time ago. Pike, she said, when that moment comes, permission is the last thing I'll be waiting for. He nodded, and then he turned and jogged out the gate to catch up with the others up toward the southern draw, up into the country that Cass Morgan understood better than any man among them, up toward the eastern ridge, where the enemy guns were already in position and already waiting, already tracking the men who thought they were the only real operators on the mountain. Cass watched them go until they disappeared into the folds of the valley. Then she went into the medical tent. She checked her trauma kit one more time, and then she did something she hadn't done since she'd arrived. She walked to the arms locker at the back of the base. She stood in front of the rifles rack there, the good ones, the precision ones, the ones no one had ever let her touch. And she looked at them the way a person looks at an old friend they've been waiting years to see again. She didn't take one. Not yet. She had her orders. She would stay behind the wire until the moment made staying impossible. But she rested her hand on the cold steel of the rack, and she waited. And out in the valley, the first pale light of dawn began to spill over the eastern ridge, right on schedule at 6:40, exactly as she'd known it would, throwing its glare straight into the eyes of the men climbing into the southern draw. Cass closed her eyes and listened. And then far off, muffled by distance and stones, she heard the first crack of a machine gun open up from the high ground. Her eyes came open. Cold, clear, certain. There it is, she said softly to no one, to her grandfather, to the mountain itself. And she reached for the rifle. The first burst of machine gun fire rolled down off the eastern ridge like thunder that had teeth, and Cass Morgan's hand closed around the cold steel of the rifle in the arms locker, and she did not move. Not yet. She had learned patience from a man who could lie in the same patch of dirt for 11 hours without so much as blinking, and patience told her the same thing now that it always had. Wait. Listen. Let the battlefield tell you what it needs before you decide what to give it. So she listened. The first gun was the machine gun she'd known would be there up on the high point, 840 meters out. She could tell from the rhythm of it, that heavy, deliberate hammering, that whoever was behind it knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't a scared kid spraying rounds. This was a professional, sighted in taking his time, walking his fire down into the southern draw exactly the way she'd sketched it in her notebook 3 nights before while grown men laughed at her from a lighted tent. Then the second gun opened up. Lower off to the left, another angle. A crossfire, just like she'd said. And then the rifle started, the sharp individual cracks of men shooting at targets, and under it all, faint and terrible, she heard the first human sound come drifting up out of the valley. A man's voice, ragged, screaming for a medic. Cass's jaw tightened. Her whole body wanted to run. Every instinct her grandfather had never quite managed to train out of her, the healer's instinct. The part of her that had gone to medical school and taken an oath. All of it was screaming at her to grab her trauma bag and go. But she held herself still, because running out that gate into an active kill zone with a first aid kit and no cover would only add one more body to the count. She knew that. She hated that she knew that. The radio in the operations tent crackled to life, and she could hear it even from where she stood, because someone had cranked the volume and the panic in the voices carried. Contact. Contact. We're taking fire from the high ground. We are pinned down in the draw. It was Ruiz, the wiry operator who 3 nights ago had wondered aloud why Cass never fought back. He wasn't wondering about anything now. His voice was pure animal fear. They're everywhere. They've got us in a crossfire we can't move. We need, oh God, Delgado's hit, Delgado's down. Cass closed her eyes for 1 second. Just one. Then she let go of the rifle and walked fast to the operations tent because the moment hadn't fully come yet, but it was coming and she wanted to be standing where she could take it when it did. Inside the tent, it was chaos. The radio operator, a nervous kid named Fowler, was hunched over the set with sweat already running down his face. There was no officer in the tent. Mercer was out there. Vickers was out there. Everyone who gave orders was down in that draw getting torn apart, which meant the base itself was being run by a 20-year-old radio man who looked like he was about to be sick. "Say again your position," Fowler was pleading into the handset. "Say again, I can't." "Vickers, is that Vickers? Somebody give me a position." The reply came back broken, chopped up by the sound of gunfire so close it distorted the transmission. And then cutting through all of it came Vickers' voice, and Cass had never heard it sound like that before. The mountain of a man who'd thrown her bag in the dirt, the man who'd told her that carrying a rifle was a man's job. That man's voice came across the radio thin and cracked and afraid. "We are in the southern draw. We are pinned down. The eastern ridge is raining fire on us, and we cannot see the shooters. I say again, we cannot spot them. The sun is right in our eyes." A pause and gunfire, and then quieter almost to himself. "It's exactly like she said. Oh God, it's exactly like she said." Fowler looked up confused. "Like who said, Senior Chief? Like who said?" But Cass already knew he was talking about her, and it gave her no satisfaction at all. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from being right about the worst thing, and she felt it settle into her chest like a stone. She'd told them. She'd stood in this exact tent and told them, and they'd laughed, and now men were dying in the funnel she'd drawn a picture of, and being right didn't save a single one of them. The radio kept bleating bad news. "Delgado's not moving. He's not moving." Ruiz again, higher now, cracking. "Ramey's hit Theo's hit in the leg. It's bad. It's real bad. We can't get to him. Every time somebody moves that machine gun, walks right onto them." "Where's the LT?" Fowler shouted into the handset. "Where's Lieutenant Mercer?" A different voice answered, younger, steadier than the others, though Cass could hear the strain underneath it, holding on by its fingernails. "Jonah Pike." "Mercer's hit," Jonah said. "He caught one in the shoulder. He's conscious, but he's down. He can't command. We've got 3, maybe 4 casualties, and we can't move any of them. The machine gun on the high ground has us completely locked. Every time we try to break contact, it cuts us apart. We need eyes on that gun. We need somebody who can find these shooters and put them down, because we are blind down here. We are absolutely blind." And there it was. The words she'd been waiting for without wanting to wait for them. Somebody who can find these shooters and put them down. Cass stepped forward. "Fowler," she said. The kid nearly jumped out of his skin. He hadn't even noticed her come in. Doc, you can't be in here. This is..." "Fowler, listen to me." Her voice was calm, not loud. Calm in a way that cut through the noise better than any shout could have. "How many people are left on this base who can shoot?" He stared at her. "What? The whole team's out there. Every operator's in that draw. Who's left inside the wire who can put rounds on target? Count them for me, right now." He looked around wildly as if the answer might be standing in a corner. There's me, and I'm on the radio, and there's the 2 guys on the wall, and they're 18 years old. They've never docked. There's nobody left who can do anything about that ridge. Everybody who could shoot is down in the He stopped. His face went white as he heard his own words. "Everybody who could shoot is down in the draw, getting shot," Cass finished for him quietly. "That's right. There's no one left." On the radio, the situation was collapsing. She could hear it in the spaces between the gunfire and the way the voices were starting to sound less like men fighting and more like men saying goodbye. Somewhere in that draw, Theo Ramey was bleeding out with a hole in his leg and no one able to reach him. Somewhere in that draw, Delgado wasn't moving at all. And on the high ground, that machine gun kept hammering patient and merciless, a metronome counting down the seconds each of those men had left. Cass Morgan turned and walked out of the tent. She didn't run. She walked fast and straight, and Fowler called after her, but she didn't stop because there was nothing left to discuss. She went to the arms locker at the back of the base, and this time she didn't rest her hand on the rifle rack and wait. This time she took the rifle down. It was a precision weapon, a designated marksman's rifle, the kind she'd been forbidden to touch since the day she arrived. She lifted it, and it settled into her hands like it had been waiting for her, like it recognized her. And for one strange floating second, she was 9 years old again, on a cold range with her grandfather's rough voice in her ear. "Feel her, Cassie. A rifle isn't a tool, she's a promise. You keep her clean and true, and when the day comes that everything's falling apart, she'll keep her end of the bargain." Cass checked the optic, checked the bore, checked the magazine seated. It felt the reassuring click. Her hands were completely steady. That was the thing that would have frightened the men down in the draw if they could have seen her. Not that she was calm, but that her hands didn't shake at all, that she moved through the weapon check with the unhurried economy of someone who had done it 10,000 times, blindfolded, hungry in the dark as a child, because a hard old man had decided that this granddaughter of his would never be helpless a day in her life. She grabbed a bandolier of magazines and slung it across her chest. She grabbed her range card, the one with the whole valley mapped in careful pencil, though she already had every number memorized. And then she stopped just for a second, because there was one more thing: the trauma bag. She looked at it sitting there, fat with tourniquets and chest seals packed the night before by a woman who already knew how this morning would go. She was a doctor. Her whole life had two halves, and they were pulling at her right now in opposite directions. One half wanted to grab that bag and find a way down into the draw to Theo Ramey and the others. The other half knew that if she didn't silence those guns first, there wouldn't be a single wounded man left to save. Her grandfather's voice one more time. You can't heal a man while the bullets are still finding him. Sometimes the most merciful thing in the world is a well-placed shot. Sometimes killing is how you save. Cass slung the trauma bag over her other shoulder. Both halves. She'd carry both. She'd be the sniper first and the doctor second, and God help anyone who tried to stop her from being either one. She turned and headed for the eastern post, the high corner of the base that looked out over the whole valley, the position she'd identified her very first night as the one place from which a single well-placed shooter could see everything and reach anything. Fowler intercepted her halfway there, the radio handset still in his hand, the cord stretched to its limit behind him. Doc, wait, wait, he was almost crying. You can't, you're the medic if you go up there and you get killed. We've got nobody, we've got no medical. You can't just... Fowler. She stopped and looked at him, and something in her face made the kid go quiet. Every man in that draw is going to die in the next 20 minutes if that machine gun keeps firing. I can hear it in their voices. You can hear it too. So you tell me, what good is a medic when the whole team's already dead? He had no answer. There wasn't one. Get back on the radio, she said gentler now. Tell them help is coming. Tell them Doc's got the eastern post. Tell them to keep their heads down and hold on for 90 more seconds. She started moving again. And Fowler, find me Jonah Pike on that net. I'm going to need his eyes. He's the only one down there who'll believe what I'm about to do. She climbed to the eastern post, and as she climbed, the sound of the battle came up to meet her. And now she could see it for the first time. The whole valley spread out below her, and the southern draw cut through it like a wound, and she could see the muzzle flashes from the eastern ridge winking in the morning light, and she could see the tiny distant shapes of her own team pinned against the rocks, not moving. Some of them not moving in the way that meant they never would again. She'd been right about all of it. The southern draw, the crossfire, the sun, the machine gun on the high point, every single thing she'd said in that tent while Vickers laughed, laid out below her now in blood and smoke. And for one more terrible second, the grief of it threatened to swallow her whole. Then she pushed it down, all the way down into the cold, quiet place her grandfather had built inside her for exactly this, and she went to work. She dropped prone at the eastern post. She settled the rifle onto the sandbags, found her natural point of aim, and let her breathing slow the way it had slowed 10,000 times before. In hold out, in hold out. Her heartbeat came down. The tremor of adrenaline that would have ruined a lesser shooter simply drained out of her in a way, and the world got very, very quiet. She found the machine gun in her optic. There it was, the high point, 840 meters exactly where she'd measured it. Two figures behind the gun, one firing, one feeding the belt. They were good. They'd chosen their position perfectly tucked into the rocks with the rising sun at their backs, invisible to the men below who were shooting blind into a glare. Invisible to everyone. Everyone except a woman lying prone on a sandbag wall who had spent 3 nights learning this valley by heart, while they all decided she was nothing. The radio on her hip crackled. Jonah Pike's voice, breathless low. Doc, is that you? Fowler says you're on the eastern post. Please tell me you're on the eastern post. Cass keyed the radio without taking her eye from the scope. I'm here, Pike. She heard him let out a breath that was almost a sob. You came. You actually came. Doc, we're dying down here. They've got a gun on the high ground. It's got us completely... I see it, Cass said. I've got eyes on the machine gun. 2 men high point of the eastern ridge. I'm going to take it now. When it goes quiet, that's your window. You get the wounded behind cover, understand? The second that gun stops, you move." There was a pause. "Doc, that gun's gotta be 800 meters out. That's can you even 840, Cass said. "I measured it 3 nights ago." And there was the faintest, driest ghost of something in her voice, almost humor, almost her grandfather's flint. "Watch the high point pike." She read the wind. It fell off the peak and swept left across the valley at 8 to 10 miles an hour, steady in the first hour of light, exactly as she'd known it would. She held for it. She held for the drop. She settled the crosshair on the gunner's chest, took up the slack in the trigger, exhaled halfway, and held. "Feel her, Cassie. She's a promise." She broke the shot. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and 840 meters away, a full second and a half later, the man behind the machine gun folded forward over his weapon and went still. The gun stopped firing. For one heartbeat, the whole valley seemed to pause as if it couldn't believe what had just happened. Then the second man, the belt feeder, scrambled for the gun, grabbing for the grips, trying to bring it back into action. Cass had already worked the bolt. She had already found him. She held, exhaled, and broke the second shot, and the belt feeder dropped across the body of the first man, and neither of them moved again. The high point went silent. On the radio, Jonah Pike made a sound she would never forget. It wasn't a cheer. It was too raw for a cheer. It was the sound of a man who had been absolutely certain he was about to die and had just been handed his life back by a woman everyone told him to ignore. "The gun's down," he breathed. "The high gun's down. The high gunnin' is down. Move, move. Get Ramey, get Mercer. Move while she's got them off us." Down in the draw, the pinned men surged into motion for the first time in what must have felt like a lifetime. Cass watched through her scope as tiny distant figures grabbed their wounded and started dragging them toward the rocks. And her heart clenched because they were exposed now out in the open, and the machine gun was down. But the battle wasn't over. Not even close. Because there was still the second gun. The one lower and to the left, the one that had made the crossfire, and there was still all the rest of it, the riflemen she'd told them a squad could move up the draw under cover. And worst of all, somewhere out there, she knew there was the one shooter she hadn't found yet. The reason all the rest of it worked. The mind behind the ambush. But that was in a minute. Right now, there was the second gun, and it had noticed that its partner on the high point had gone quiet, and it was swinging its fire toward the men who'd broken cover. Cass found it. Lower ridge, maybe 600 meters tucked behind a spur of rock. Harder angle. Only the barrel and a sliver of the gunner visible. She adjusted her hold, read the new distance, read the wind that ran different down there in the lee of the spur, and this was the shot that separated a marksman from a legend, because a sliver of a man behind rock at 600 meters is a shot most shooters wouldn't even take. She took it. The round clipped his gunner, and he jerked back out of sight, and the second gun's fire went wild, sprang up into the sky, and then it stopped too, and Cass didn't know if she'd killed him or just wounded him, but it didn't matter because the men in the draw got the 2 seconds they needed and dragged the last of the wounded behind the rocks. "Both guns are down," Jonah was shouting on the net now. No longer bothering to keep his voice low, because for the first time the enemy had something to fear instead of just prey to harvest. "Both guns are down. We're behind cover, Doc. How are you doing this? How are you?" "Stay with me, Pike," Cass said, working the bolt scanning. "It's not over. They came here with a plan, and the plan just fell apart, which means they're going to do one of two things. They're going to run or they're going to push. And these men don't strike me as the running kind." She paused, scanning the draw. "How many can still fight down there?" A grim silence. Then Matt Ruiz, 2 others, and one of them's got a bad hand. Everybody else is down. Mercer's alive, but he's out of it. Vickers is, Jonah's voice caught. Vickers is pinned separate from us, Doc. He got cut off when it started. He's behind a rock about 40 meters from the rest of us, and every time he moves, somebody takes a shot at him. He's alive, but he can't get to us, and we can't get to him. Cass felt something twist in her chest, and she hated that it twisted, because Daniel Vickers was the man who'd thrown her bag in the dirt and told a yard full of laughing men that carrying a rifle was a man's job and she'd never have what it took. And now that same man was pinned alone behind a rock 40 meters from safety, and the only person on this mountain who could reach out across that valley and clear the shooters keeping him there was the woman he'd humiliated. "Where's the shooter on Vickers?" she said. "Pike, I need you to find him for me. You're my eyes. Where are the rounds coming from when he tries to move?" I can't see everything." "Yes, you can. Slow down. Breathe. You've watched me for a week now. You know how to look. Next time Vickers shifts, watch for the flash or the dust. Don't look for the man. Look for the sign of the man. Tell me a direction and a distance. That's all I need." There was a long pause, and Cass could picture him down there, this 23-year-old kid, the only one who'd ever bothered to see her clearly trying to do the things she'd spent a childhood learning to do. And then his voice came back tight with concentration. Okay, there's a cluster of rocks 10 o'clock from Vickers up the slope, maybe 200 meters from him. When he moves, the dust kicks up right at the base of it. I think there's two of them tucked in those rocks." Cass swung her scope to the cluster of rocks. It took her 3 long seconds, and then she saw it. The faint suggestion of movement, the barrel of a rifle laid across a stone. Jonah was right. He'd found them. The kid had actually found them. "Good Pike," she said, and she meant it. "That's good work. Now watch this." She sighted on the rocks. She waited. She needed one of them to give her more than a barrel, and so she keyed the radio and said, "Vickers, can Vickers hear me on this net?" A crackle, and then a voice she barely recognized, hoarse and stripped of every ounce of its old swagger. "This is Vickers. Go." For a second, Cass couldn't speak because there was a whole speech sitting in her chest, a week's worth of humiliation with a right to be spoken. "Real operators, a man's job. Keep the coffee warm, Doc." She could have said any of it. He'd have had to sit there and take it pinned behind his rock at her mercy. She didn't say any of it. "Senior Chief," she said, calm and steady. "On my mark, I need you to lean out to your right. Just for 1 second. Draw their fire. I've got the shooter spotted, and I need them to show themselves. Can you do that for me?" There was a silence on the net, and in that silence, Cass understood was Daniel Vickers absorbing the full weight of what was happening, that his life was now in the hands of the person he'd told 100 times to stay behind the wire, that the medic, the nurse, the woman who wasn't a real operator was about to ask him to bet his life on her marksmanship. She heard him swallow. "Copy," he said at last, and his voice broke a little on the word. "On your mark, Doc." "3," Cass said, settling the rifle. 2, 1, mark. 40 meters below, in a valley away, Vickers leaned out from behind his rock, exposing himself for 1 full second, and the 2 shooters in the cluster of rocks both rose to take the shot. And Cass Morgan was already waiting for them. And she broke the first shot before either of them ever fired, and then worked the bolt and broke the second 2 rounds in less than 2 seconds, and both men dropped back into the rocks and did not rise again. "Move, Vickers," Jonah was screaming. "They're down. Both of them are down. Move, get to us, go." And Daniel Vickers, the mountain of a man, came up off the ground and ran 40 meters across open ground that had been a death sentence 10 seconds earlier, and no rounds came because the woman he'd humiliated had cleared the way, and he crashed into the rocks beside Jonah Pike and the others and lay there gasping alive because of her. For a moment there was almost quiet. The 2 machine guns were down. The shooters covering Vickers were down. The men were consolidated behind cover with their wounded. And Cass, prone on the eastern post, allowed herself 1 single breath. That wasn't a shooter's breath. 1 human breath before her grandfather's voice pulled her back. "It's not over till it's over, Cassie. The dangerous one is the one you haven't found yet." And that was when she felt it. The thing that had been nagging at the back of her mind since the first shot. 2 machine guns, a squad of riflemen, a textbook L-shaped ambush laid in the exact spot she'd predicted. This was not a random band of fighters who'd gotten lucky. This was a plan, an intelligent, disciplined, professional plan. And every plan like this had an author. A single mind that had chosen this ground, positioned these guns, timed this attack for the exact minute the sun would blind the men in the draw. That mind was still out there, watching. And it had just watched its entire ambush get dismantled by a single shooter it couldn't locate, and it would be doing exactly what Cass was doing right now, which was hunting. 2 hunters now in the same valley looking for each other. "Pike," she said quietly into the radio, "listen to me carefully. This ambush had a leader. Somebody who set all this up. A real shooter, disciplined, probably the one who's been the hardest to spot this whole time. And he's still out there, and right now he's looking for me the same way I'm looking for him." "How do you know that?" "Because I would be, Cass said simply, because that's what I do. He knows he's got one problem left on this whole battlefield, and it's the shooter on the eastern post, and he's going to try to find me and put me down before I can find him. So I need you to help me find him first. She scanned the valley slow and methodical, every fold, every shadow, every place she herself would choose if she'd been the one setting the trap. Where would you hide Pike? If you wanted to see the whole draw in the eastern post at the same time, where's the one position that overlooks everything? There was a pause, and then Jonah, his voice gone very small, said, Doc, the same place you're worried about. There's a shelf high up on the far ridge, northeast. It sees everything. It sees the draw. And Doc, it sees your post. It sees right down onto the eastern post. Cass went very still, because in the same instant that Jonah said it, some ancient instinct her grandfather had buried in her bones fired all at once, the instinct that had kept scout snipers alive for 100 years. The animal, knowing that, says you are being watched right now. And she understood two things in the same frozen half-second. The first was that the mind behind the ambush had already found the answer to where the eastern post shooter was. The second was that she had spent the last 4 minutes firing round after round from a fixed position muzzle blast, kicking dust with every shot, marking her location as plainly as a signal flare, doing the one thing her grandfather had warned her against 10,000 times. You shoot and you move, Cassie. You stay in one place and you're not a sniper anymore. You're a target. She was a target. And somewhere on a high shelf to the northeast, a disciplined, patient professional shooter had been watching the eastern post, waiting, letting her expend herself, letting her think she was the hunter, and he had a rifle trained on the exact patch of sandbag where Cass Morgan lay, and his finger was already tightening on the trigger. Doc, move, Jonah screamed. He's on the shelf. He's northeast. Move now. Cass threw herself sideways off the sandbags. In the same instant, the round came in, and she heard it before she felt it. The vicious, supersonic crack of a heavy bullet passing through the exact space where her head had been, a quarter second before, close enough that the shock wave of it slapped her cheek close enough that a half-second slower, and there would have been no Cass Morgan left to save anyone. She hit the ground hard behind the sandbags and lay there with her heart slamming against her ribs. And for the first time all morning, her hands were not steady. For the first time all morning, she was afraid. Because now she understood exactly what she was up against. Not a lucky fighter, not a scared kid behind a gun. A shooter as good as she was, maybe better. A shooter who had just proven he could find her, who had a superior position, who was looking down on her from higher ground, with the whole valley in his scope, and who now knew for certain where she was. The hunter had become the hunted, and she was pinned to a sandbag wall on a mountain full of dead and dying men, with one enemy left, the most dangerous one of all, holding every advantage. Cass Morgan pressed herself flat against the earth, her cheek in the dirt, that graze of supersonic air still burning across her face, and she heard her grandfather's voice come to her one more time, quiet and certain, the way it always came when everything else had fallen away. Now, Cassie, now you find out what you're really made of. Cass Morgan lay flat against the earth with her cheek pressed into the cold dirt, and for 3 full seconds, she did nothing at all except breathe, because 3 seconds was exactly how long she allowed herself to be afraid. Her grandfather had taught her that too. Fear is a tool, Cassie, not a master. You feel it, you use it, and then you put it back in the drawer. So she felt it. She felt the graze of that supersonic round still burning across her cheek. She felt the certainty that a man on a high shelf to the northeast wanted her dead more than he'd ever wanted anything. And then she put it in the drawer and got to work. She could not stay here. That was the first and most important truth, and it was the one every part of her wanted to argue with, because the sandbags were cover, and the open ground behind her was not. But the shooter on the shelf already had this position ranged. He'd fired one round and missed by a quarter inch, which meant his next round would not miss, because a shooter that good only needed one correction. The moment she lifted her head above these sandbags, she was dead. The sandbags weren't protecting her anymore. They were a coffin she just hadn't climbed into yet. Doc, Jonah Pike's voice cracked through the radio, frantic. Doc, are you hit? Talk to me. Are you hit? She keyed the radio, still flat, still not moving. I'm not hit. She heard him exhale like he'd been holding his breath since the shot. He almost got you. I saw the round hit the sandbags. I thought, Doc, he's on that shelf. He's got the high ground, and he's got your post cold. You have to get out of there. I know, Cass said. Her voice was calm again. The 3 seconds were over. Pike, I need you to be my eyes now, all of them. Everything I've got depends on you for the next few minutes. Do you understand me? I can't lift my head to look for him, ma'am. The second I do, he ends this. So you're going to be my scope. You're going to find him, and you're going to talk me onto him, and I'm going to take a shot at a man I can't even see. Can you do that? There was a silence on the net that lasted a heartbeat too long. I'm not you, Jonah said finally, and there was raw fear in it, the fear of a young man who understands that lives now depend on him doing a thing he's never done. Doc, I've watched you for a week. I'm not a sniper. I can't. You found the 2 men in the rocks that were pinning Vickers, Cass cut in, steady and hard. You did that. Nobody talked you onto them. You found them yourself. You found the shelf before I did. You've got the eye, Pike. You've always had it. You just never had anybody tell you so. Well, I'm telling you now, you've got it. And right now, you're the only man on this mountain who can help me kill the one thing that can still kill all of us. So you're going to be enough because you have to be. Understood. Another silence, and then quieter, steadier than before, like something had settled into place inside him. Understood. Tell me what you need. That was the moment Cass knew the kid was going to make it. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because he decided to be useful anyway. That was the whole thing right there. That was everything her grandfather had ever tried to teach her about courage, wrapped up in one scared 23-year-old choosing to hold the line. First thing, she said, I need you to keep him honest. He's watching my post. As long as he thinks I'm still behind these sandbags, he's going to keep his scope trained right here waiting for me to pop up. I want him to keep thinking that, so I'm going to give him something to look at. She reached up, slow and careful, and pulled her helmet off. She set it on the muzzle of a spare rifle Fowler had left racked at the post, and she eased the whole thing up above the lip of the sandbags, just an inch, just enough. A silhouette, a suggestion of a head where a head should be. The round came in almost instantly. It punched through the helmet and sang off into the rocks, and Cass yanked the rifle back down, and the helmet spun away into the dirt with a hole clean through it. But she'd gotten what she needed, because in the instant that round came in lying flat with her ear to the ground, she'd felt the direction of it, the line of it, the way you feel which way a slammed door is in a dark house. And more than that, she'd heard something, a tiny fraction of delay between the crack of the bullet passing and the duller boom of the muzzle report rolling in behind it. She counted it in her head, that gap, the way her grandfather had made her count it 1,000 times as a girl. Pike, she said, the round that just hit my helmet. Did you see anything, a flash dust, anything up on that shelf? I was watching, he said fast. I saw it. Doc, I saw a little puff of smoke northeast shelf, right side of it, up near that dark seam in the rock. I can't see the man, but I saw where it came from. Right side of the shelf by the dark seam. Cass closed her eyes and built the picture in her mind because she couldn't lift her head to build it with her eyes, the northeast shelf. She'd mapped it 3 nights ago. She had it in her notebook. She had it memorized. She knew the distance to it because she knew the distance to everything in this valley. The shelf sat at roughly 950 meters, farther than the machine gun, farther than anything she'd shot at all morning. 950 meters uphill, into a position she couldn't see at a man who could see her perfectly. Every advantage was his. Distance, elevation, cover, vision. She had exactly one thing he didn't, and it was a scared kid with a good eye lying in a ditch 400 meters closer to the target. That gap, she murmured mostly to herself. The delay between the crack and the boom. What? Jonah said. Nothing, just confirming a number. She'd counted it. The gap told her the range, and the range matched her memory of the shelf 950, give or take. Her grandfather's old trick. 2 ways to measure the same distance, and when both agree, you trust the shot. Both agreed. But knowing the range was the easy part. The hard part was that she still couldn't see him, and she couldn't see him because he was smart enough to shoot from the shadow of that dark seam where his muzzle blast wouldn't flare in the light, where a man could fire all day and never give away more than a puff of smoke. He'd chosen his position exactly the way she'd have chosen hers. She was hunting her own reflection, and her reflection had the better ground. Okay, Pike, new problem, she said. I can't shoot what I can't see. He's tucked in that dark seam and he's not going to show himself, not for anything, because he's disciplined and he knows he's already got the winning hand. So I need to make him move. I need to make him do something stupid. And the only thing that makes a shooter like that break discipline is if he thinks he's about to lose his target, if he thinks I'm getting away. How do we do that? Cass was quiet for a second, then she said, "You're not going to like it." "Doc, I already don't like any of this. Just tell me." "I'm going to move out from behind these sandbags across the open to the north corner of the post. It's maybe 15 feet of exposed ground." She said it flatly the way you'd read a grocery list, and it landed on Jonah like a blow. "That's suicide," he breathed. "Doc, no. He'll drop you the second you leave cover. That's exactly what he's waiting for. You said it yourself." "He'll try," Cass agreed, "but here's what's going to happen. When I break cover and run, he's going to track me. He's going to swing that rifle to follow me, and to do it fast enough to hit a moving target at 900 meters, he's going to have to shift his whole body, and when he shifts, he's going to come out of that dark seam just a little, just for a second, just enough for you to see him clean instead of just his smoke. And when you see him, you're going to call it, and you're going to talk me onto him, and the second I reach the north corner, I'm going to drop and take the sheet before he can reacquire me." She paused. "It's 1 second, Pike. That's the whole plan. I give him 1 second of a moving target, and in that second, you find him and I kill him. 1 second or I don't come home." The radio was silent. She could feel Jonah's horror through it, the weight of what she was asking, that his eyes and his call in a single second would be the only thing standing between Cass Morgan and a bullet. "There has to be another way," he said, and his voice was thick. "Doc, there has to be. I can't if I'm too slow, if I don't see him fast enough. That's it. That's you gone. I can't carry that." "There's no other way," Cass said gently. "We're out of time. Every minute we lie here talking, Theo Ramey is bleeding and Mercer's fading, and Delgado might already be gone. I don't know. Every man down there is on a clock, and the clock doesn't stop until this shooter's dead. So this is the way. And Pike, you're not going to be too slow. You know why. Why? Because you're the only person here who ever bothered to actually look at me," Cass said quietly. "From that first night when everybody else saw a nurse, you saw something else. You've got the eye. You've had it all along. I'm betting my life on it right now, and I'm not a woman who bets careless. Now get ready. Northeast shelf, dark seam, right side. When I break you, watch that seam like it's the last thing you'll ever look at, and you call him the instant he shows. You ready?" A long breath on the net, and then steady resolved, a young man who had just grown 10 years in 10 minutes. "Ready. Go when you're ready, Doc. I've got you. I've got the seam. Go." Cass gathered herself. She got her feet under her, low coiled. She had the rifle across her body ready to bring up and drop into position the instant she reached the north corner. She ran the whole thing one more time in her head, the 15 feet, the drop, the hold, the range of 950, the wind, the elevation, the 1 second she'd have before a professional put a round through her spine. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about all the mornings on the range, all the times she'd wanted to quit, and he wouldn't let her, all the times he'd said one more. "Cassie, always one more, because one day the one more will be the one that matters, and you won't get to practice it first." This was the one more. This was the one that mattered, and she wouldn't get to practice it first. 3, she said into the radio, her voice absolutely steady. 2, 1, so. Moving. She broke from behind the sandbags and ran. The world slowed down the way it always did in the moments that counted, stretched out long and clear, and she was aware of everything: the ground under her boots, the rifle in her hands, the impossibly wide open space between her and the north corner. She counted her own steps. 1, 2, and somewhere on a shelf 950 meters away, a disciplined professional saw a woman break from cover and did exactly what Cass had known he would do, exactly what she'd bet her life he would do. He swung his rifle to track her. He came up out of his shadow. He committed. "There," Jonah screamed on the net. I see him, Doc. He's up right side of the seam. He leaned out. He's tracking you. He's right of the dark seam. By maybe 2 feet, he's leaning out to your right." Cass hit the north corner and dropped. She dropped the way her grandfather had made her drop 10,000 times, going straight from a dead run into a stable prone, and under a second, the rifle already coming up, already finding the shelf, her breath already halfway out. And there, right where Jonah said right of the dark seam leaning out to follow her run, was a shape, a man. The mind behind the ambush, the shooter who'd killed her helmet and grazed her cheek and pinned an entire SEAL team in a valley of blood, out in the open at last, committed to a moving target, his own scope still swinging to find where she'd gone. He hadn't found her yet. She'd already found him. 950 meters. She held for the drop, held for the wind that ran down the far ridge, settled the crosshair on the center of that leaning shape. And in the quarter second before she broke the shot, she heard her grandfather's voice one final time. Not shouting, not urgent, just there the way he'd always been there, in the cold and the dark and the one more. Now, Cassie, send it. She broke the shot. The rifle bucked. The round left the barrel at 950 meters and crossed the valley in something under a second and a half in which Cass did not breathe and did not blink and did not move. And at the end of it, the leaning shape on the northeast shelf snapped backward and vanished into the dark seam and did not come out again. The radio was dead silent. "Pike," Cass said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Talk to me. Is he down?" Silence. "Pike, is he down?" And then Jonah Pike's voice came back, and it was shaking, and it was awed, and it was the voice of a man who had just watched something he would tell his grandchildren about someday, and they wouldn't believe him. "He's down. Doc, he's down. He's not moving. You got him. You 950 meters. You called it, and you got him. He's down. Oh my God, he's down." Cass let her forehead drop against the stock of the rifle. She let herself breathe. One breath. Two. And in those breaths, she felt the whole morning catch it up to her all at once, the fear and the grief and the impossible weight of what she just carried. And her hands, which had been steady through every single shot, finally began to shake now that they were allowed to. But she didn't let herself rest. She couldn't, because a sniper's job is never done when the shooting stops, and her grandfather's voice had one more thing to say. "Confirm your kill, Cassie. Confirm it, then scan. Assume there's one more until the battlefield tells you there isn't." "Pike," she said, lifting her head, bringing the scope back up, forcing her shaking hands to still. "Scan the valley, everything. Tell me what you see. Are they running?" There was a pause while he looked, and then wonder creeping into his exhaustion. "They're running, Doc, they're running. The second that last shooter went down, they broke. Whoever was left, they're pulling back. I count maybe 6, 7 of them falling back up the north draw. They're done. They're leaving, they're dead. They're gone, Doc. It's over. The ambush is over. You broke them. One shooter on a sandbag wall and you broke the whole thing." For a long moment, Cass didn't answer because she couldn't. She lay there on the north corner of the eastern post with the rifle warm in her shaking hands, and she watched through her own scope the enemy that had come to kill an entire SEAL team come apart and flee, and she understood that she had done it. Alone. Underestimated, forbidden, laughed at, left behind the wire. Told 100 times that she wasn't a real operator. She had done the thing that not one of the real operators had been able to do. She had held the ridge alone. But there was no triumph in her chest. Not yet. Because she was a doctor before she'd ever picked up this rifle this morning, and the shooting was over now, which meant her other job, her first job, her oldest and deepest job, was about to begin. And down in that draw, men were dying, who she might still be able to save if she was fast enough, if she wasn't already too late. She keyed the radio one more time. "Pike, casualties. Give me casualties right now, all of them, who's alive and how bad. Fast." His voice sobered instantly, the wonder draining out, replaced by the grim arithmetic of the wounded. "Ramey's the worst. Theo took it in the leg, high the thigh, Doc. There's so much blood we got a tourniquet on, but it kept coming, and I don't think we did it right. He's going gray. He's barely talking. Mercer's shoulder is through and through. He's conscious now, but he's weak. Delgado." A pause and grief in it. "Delgado's gone, Doc. He was gone before you ever got up here. There was nothing anybody could have." "Ramey first," Cass said, already moving, already up off the ground, already slinging the rifle and grabbing the trauma bag she'd carried all this way for exactly this. "Tell me about Ramey. High thigh, you said. Is the blood bright red and pumping, or dark and steady?" "Bright," Jonah said immediately. "Bright red. It was pumping before the tourniquet. It came out in spurts." "Femoral," Cass said, And her voice went cold and clinical and absolutely certain, the doctor now all the way. The sniper folded away and put back in her grandfather's drawer. He's got a femoral bleed. That tourniquet's not high enough, or not tight enough, or both. And if we don't fix it in the next few minutes, he's gonna die, Pike. He's going to die of a wound that is completely survivable if I can just get my hands on it. Where are you? Give me your position. The fastest covered route from the eastern post to Ramey right now. Doc, you can't come down here. There might still be. They're running, you said it yourself. They're gone. Route Pike, now. I'm already moving. And she was. She was down off the eastern post and moving fast along the base wall toward the south gate, the trauma bag banging against her hip, the rifle across her back running toward the draw, where she'd been forbidden to go toward the men who'd laughed at her, toward Theo. Ramey bleeding out from a wound she knew exactly how to fix. Jonah called the route to her turn by turn, and she took it at a dead run. And as she ran, she was already talking, already commanding, already saving him from 400 meters away. Pike, listen to me. You're going to do exactly what I say, and you're going to do it now before I get there, because he doesn't have the minutes to wait for me. The tourniquet you have on, I need you to move it higher. High and tight, up toward the groin above the wound, right up into the crease of the hip. High as it'll go. Do it now, and I mean tight, tighter than you think you can. Tight enough that it hurts you to crank it. He's going to scream. Let him scream. A screaming man is a living man. Do it. She heard him relaying it, heard the grunt of effort, heard faintly, terribly, Theo Ramey's raw cry of pain carry across the distance. And she thought, good, scream, because you can't scream if you're dead, and she ran faster. It's on, Jonah gasped. It's high, it's tight, it's Doc, the blood, it's slowing, it's actually slowing. Good. That's good. Now find the pressure point, and don't you dare let go until I'm there. I'm 90 seconds out. He's going to make it, Pike. You hear me? You did that. You just kept him alive. 90 seconds. Keep him talking. Keep him with you. Tell him Doc is coming, and Doc doesn't lose the ones she gets her hands on. 90 seconds. And Cass Morgan ran through the south gate of Firebase Anchor and out into the open ground she'd been forbidden to cross, out toward the draw, full of her wounded and her dead. The rifle that had held the ridge across her back, and the bag that would save what could still be saved in her hands. Both halves of her running as one, and every man who'd ever called her just a medic about to learn, in the space of the next 90 seconds, exactly how wrong the whole world had been about Cass Morgan. Cass hit the mouth of the draw at a full run, and the war she'd only seen through a scope became real in a way no optic could ever make it. The smell of it reached her first cordite and copper, and the particular sharpness of torn earth, and then the sounds, the low animal groaning of men in pain, and she didn't slow down for any of it. She'd trained her whole life for the shooting. She'd trained even longer for this. Her grandfather had made her a sniper, but her own two hands, in medical school and in every trauma base since, had made her something else on top of it. And now both trainings ran side by side inside her, and neither one flinched. She found Jonah Pike crouched over a broad shape in the dirt, both hands buried in the crease of a man's hip. His knuckles white, his whole body leaning into the pressure, like his life depended on it. And in a way it did, because Theo Ramey's life depended on it. And Jonah had decided somewhere in the last 2 minutes that Ramey's life was the only thing in the world that mattered. Doc, he gasped when he saw her, and his voice broke clean in half on the single syllable. Doc, he's fading. I can't feel his pulse, the same he stopped talking. He was talking, and then he stopped. Move your top hand. Keep the bottom one right where it is. Cass was already down on her knees in the blood. The trauma bag opened, her hands moving with a speed and certainty that made Jonah go quiet just watching them. Theo Ramey, look at me. Open your eyes and look at me right now. That's an order. The wounded SEAL's eyes fluttered. He was gray, the particular gray of a man who has lost too much and is deciding somewhere below thought whether it's worth the effort to stay. Cass had seen that gray before. She'd beaten it before. She had no intention of losing to it now, not after everything, not this close. There he is, she said, and her voice changed, softened, became a lifeline instead of a command. Hey, Theo, stay with me. You know who this is? This is Doc, the one you all left behind the wire this morning. A tight, grim flicker of something that was almost a smile. Turns out you needed the wire sitter after all. So you're going to stay alive just to be embarrassed about it later. Deal. Something moved in Theo Ramey's gray face, the ghost of a laugh or the wish for one. His lips moved. Doc, he managed. You shot. I did a lot of shooting, yeah. We'll talk about it when you're not trying to die on me. Right now, I need you to breathe and let me work. Her hands never stopped. She had the wound exposed now, and she saw exactly what she'd known she'd see from 400 meters away. The femoral torn but not severed, the tourniquet Jonah had cranked high and tight, the only reason there was still a man here to save it all. Pike, this tourniquet you put on, you saved his life with it. I want you to hear me say that right now because you might not believe it later. He was 30 seconds from gone and you pulled him back. That's yours. Nobody can ever take that from you. Jonah didn't answer. He couldn't. But something in his shoulders shook loose some terror he'd been carrying, and Cass saw it go and was glad because she needed his hands steady for what came next. Now I need you again, she said. Both hands right here exactly where I put them. We're going to pack this wound and I need pressure while I do it. You ready? Ready. What followed Jonah Pike would remember for the rest of his life. He would try to describe it to people later and fail because there were no words for the way Cass Morgan's hands moved, the calm of them, the certainty, the way she talked the whole time in that low, even voice, half to Theo and half to Jonah, and half it seemed to some third listener who wasn't there, an old man, maybe a teacher, someone who had drilled this same calm into her across a childhood nobody on this base had ever imagined. She packed the wound. She managed the pressure. She got a line in fast, her fingers finding the vein on the first try in a man whose veins had nearly given up. And slowly and possibly, the gray began to retreat from Theo Ramey's face, pushed back inch by a woman on her knees in his blood who simply refused to let him go. His color's coming back, Jonah whispered. Doc, his colors, he's pinking up. He's not out of it yet, but he's not leaving today either, Cass said. She sat back on her heels for a single second. Just one wiped the back of her wrist across her forehead and left a smear of someone else's blood there, without noticing. He needs a bird. He needs surgery and blood and a real hospital, and he needs it in the next hour. Where's the medevac Pike? Somebody called for a bird. Tell me somebody called for a bird. Fowler's been screaming for one on the net since it started. It's inbound, but the LZ, the only LZ is exposed. I know I mapped it. Of course she'd mapped it. She'd mapped everything. It's fine, the shooters are gone. I cleared the ridge that bird can land. Get Fowler, get me an ETA and start moving the walking wounded toward the LZ now so we're not carrying everybody at once when it comes in. And that was the moment, kneeling in the blood of the man she just saved, giving orders that a whole team of trained operators leapt to obey without a second's hesitation, that Cass Morgan stopped being the medic they'd left behind the wire and became, in the eyes of every man who survived that draw, something none of them had a word for yet. Not just an operator, something more. The one who held the ridge and then came down into the killing ground to save the wounded with the same hands. The sniper and the healer. The same person, the same quiet woman they'd all decided was nothing. She moved to Mercer next. The lieutenant was propped against a rock. His shoulder wrecked, his face slack with blood loss and something worse, the dawning horror of a man realizing exactly how badly he'd failed. He'd overruled her in that tent. He'd taken the southern draw. He'd led his men into the exact killing funnel she'd drawn a picture of, and now 3 of them were down and 1 was dead, and he was alive only because the woman he'd dismissed had disobeyed every order he'd ever given her. Morgan, he rasped when she knelt beside him and started working on his shoulder. He could barely look at her. Morgan, the draw, you told me. You stood in that tent and you told me exactly what would happen, and I... Hold still, sir. Through and through, it looks worse than it is. You're going to keep the arm. I didn't listen to you. His voice cracked. This was a man unraveling, and Cass had seen that too, the particular collapse of a leader who has led men to their deaths. Delgado's dead because I didn't listen to you. Those men are torn apart because I... Sir? She stopped working for just a moment and looked him in the eye, and her voice was not unkind, but it was iron. You can carry that later. You've earned the right to carry it, and you will, and I won't tell you not to because it's true and lying to you won't help. But right now you're my patient, and I need you conscious and calm so I can get you on that bird. So you're going to breathe, and you're going to hold still, and you're going to save the reckoning for when it can't cost anybody else their life. Can you do that for me? Mercer stared at her. And something in the way she said it, the sheer absence of cruelty in a moment when she'd have been entitled to all the cruelty in the world, broke him open worse than any accusation could have. "Yes, Doc," he whispered. "God, yes." The medevac came in 11 minutes later, flaring down onto the exposed LZ that Cass had promised was safe. And it was safe because she'd made it safe, and the crew found a scene that made no sense to them. A doctor covered head to toe in other men's blood, running the entire casualty operation with the crisp authority of a combat commander. A rifle still slung across her back. Wounded, triaged, and staged and ready. "Lieutenant." A team of SEALs, some of them weeping, all of them doing exactly what she said the instant she said it. They loaded Theo Ramey first, then Mercer, then the others, and Cass worked the whole time, moving from man to man, checking lines, adjusting tourniquets, talking to each one in that same low, even voice that told them without ever quite saying it that they were going to live because she had decided they would. And then there was Vickers. She hadn't seen him since he'd made his run across the open 40 meters, since she'd cleared the shooters that pinned him and sent him sprinting into cover. He'd come through the fight with nothing worse than scrapes and a wrenched knee, physically the least hurt man in the draw. But he wasn't standing with the others. He was off to the side alone, and he was watching Cass Morgan the way a man watches something he doesn't understand and is afraid of. And there was on his hard-weathered face an expression Jonah Pike had never once seen there in all the time he'd known him. Shame. Naked, total, unbearable shame. Cass finished loading the last of the wounded and straightened up, and for a moment the two of them just looked at each other across the bloody ground, the senior chief who'd thrown her bag in the dirt, and the medic who'd saved his life and everyone else's. All the words he'd said to her hung in the air between them. Real operators, a man's job. Keep the coffee warm, Doc. Stay behind the wire. Vickers opened his mouth. Nothing came out. This mountain of a man, this senior chief with 20 years and 3 wars behind him, stood there in front of a woman half his size and could not find a single word because there were no words big enough for what he owed her, and he knew it. Cass didn't make him find them. Not there, not then. "You're not hurt, Senior Chief?" she asked, and her voice was flat and professional, a medic clearing a patient, nothing more. He shook his head slowly. "No, I'm no. Thanks to you." The last 2 words came out strangled, like they'd cost him something to say, and they had. "Then help me get these men on the bird," Cass said. "We can do the rest later." And that was all. She turned back to the work. But as she did, she caught Jonah Pike watching the whole exchange, and the kid gave her a look. She'd remember a look of such complete understanding that it said more than any speech could have. He'd seen it, all of it, from the first night on the edge of the base when she'd told him where the enemy would put their gun to this moment in the blood-soaked draw, where every man who doubted her stood humbled and alive because of her. He'd been the only one who ever looked, and now finally everyone was looking. The medevac lifted off with the wounded, and the sound of it faded up and out over the ridge Cass had held alone, and the survivors of Firebase Anchor stood in the wreckage of the ambush and looked at the woman in their center, and not one of them. Not even Vickers could meet her eyes for long, because there was something in them now that hadn't been there before, or maybe had always been there and they'd simply refused to see it. Cass Morgan wiped the blood from her hands as best she could, slung the rifle a little higher on her back, and looked out at the valley one last time at the eastern shelf, where the last shooter lay dead, at the southern draw, where a good man named Delgado had died before she could reach him, at the whole terrible chessboard she'd read 3 nights ago while they laughed at her from a lighted tent. She didn't feel like a hero. Heroes, she thought, were what people called you afterward when they needed a clean story. What she felt was tired and paid for the men she couldn't save, and underneath it all, quiet and steady, the certainty her grandfather had built into her bones a lifetime ago. She had been exactly what she'd always been, the one who watched, the one who was ready, the one nobody saw right up until the moment they had no one else to turn to. And as the last of the smoke cleared over Firebase Anchor, Cass Morgan knew with the same cold certainty she brought to a 900-meter shot that nothing on this mountain would ever look at her the same way again. The days after the ambush did not bring the thing Cass Morgan expected, which was nothing at all. She'd braced for silence. She'd braced for the awkward, clumsy avoidance of men who owe a debt they don't know how to name. The way people cross the street to avoid someone they've wronged. She had told herself, lying awake that first night with the battle still ringing in her ears, that she wanted nothing from any of them, that she'd done what she'd done because it needed doing and not for their gratitude, and most of that was even true. But the silence didn't come. Something stranger came instead. It started the next morning before dawn, when Cass came out of the medical tent to find a cup of coffee sitting on the crate outside the flap. Still hot, nobody around, she stood there looking at it for a long moment, this small, stupid cup of coffee, and something tightened in her throat that she didn't let anyone see because she understood exactly what it was. Vickers had told her that last morning before the patrol to keep the coffee warm. It had been a taunt then. Now somehow, in the wordless language of men who don't know how to apologize, it was the opposite of a taunt. It was the first brick in something being rebuilt. She never found out for certain who left it, but she noticed that Vickers didn't quite look at her when she thanked the yard in general for it, and she noticed the tips of his ears go red, and she let it go because some men can only say sorry with their hands and never with their mouths, and she'd made her peace with that a long time ago. The real reckoning came 4 days later. Word had traveled. That was the thing about a fight like that. The story got up and walked on its own legs faster than any report. By the time the after-action review was scheduled, everyone from the base commander down to the newest private had heard some version of it, and most of the versions were wrong, inflated into legend, and the truth was somehow bigger than all of them. The doctor who wasn't allowed to carry a rifle had picked one up and held an entire ridge alone, had broken an ambush that outnumbered the team 6-1, had made a 950-meter shot on the enemy's sniper, who'd pinned them all called onto target by a 23-year-old kid, and then run down into the kill zone and saved 3 men with the same hands. The review was held in the operations tent, the same tent where Cass had stood 4 nights before and told them exactly what would happen and been laughed out of the room. The base commander was there, a full colonel who'd flown in specifically, and Mercer was there with his arm in a sling, pale but on his feet, and Vickers, and Jonah Pike, and every operator who'd survived the draw. Cass stood at the back the way she always stood at the back, and waited for it to be about the mission and not about her. It didn't stay about the mission for long. The colonel ran through the timeline, the intelligence failures, the tactical picture, and then he came to the part everyone was waiting for, and he set down his notes and looked up, and his eyes went straight to the back of the tent, straight to Cass. "Dr. Morgan," he said, "I've read 3 separate DSCM accounts of what happened on that ridge. They don't agree on much, but they agree on one thing." He paused. "Every man who walked out of that draw walked out because of you. Is that accurate?" The tent was silent. Every head had turned to her. Cass held the colonel's gaze. "I did what the situation required, sir." "That's not what I asked." The colonel's voice was quiet, but it filled the whole tent. "I asked if it's accurate that every surviving man owes you his life. And I'm asking because I've got a senior chief and a lieutenant standing in this tent who both independently and writing told me it is. So I'll ask you one more time, and I want a straight answer. Did you hold that ridge alone?" And that was the moment Cass had known was coming, and dreaded because a straight answer to that question was a kind of nakedness, and she'd spent her whole life clothed in the safety of being underestimated. To say yes was to step out from behind the wire in front of everyone forever and never step back. She didn't get to answer, because Daniel Vickers stepped forward. He came off the wall where he'd been standing, this mountain of a man, and he moved to the center of the tent, and he stood at attention in front of the colonel, and when he spoke, his voice was rough, and it did not waver. "Sir, permission to speak." "Granted, Senior Chief." Vickers took a breath, and then in front of the colonel and the officers, and every operator who'd ever laughed along with him in front of the woman he'd humiliated in the yard with a rifle in his hands, Daniel Vickers did the hardest thing Jonah Pike had ever seen a man do. "Sir, before the mission, I wanted on the record that I treated Dr. Morgan with contempt." His jaw worked. "I told her to her face that carrying a rifle was a man's job. I told her she wasn't a real operator. I told her to stay behind the wire and leave the fighting to men who knew how. I said those things in front of the team more than once, and I made sure it hurt." He stopped. The whole tent had gone so quiet you could hear the wind against the canvas. "And when that draw turned into a slaughter, sir, when I was pinned alone behind a rock, 40 meters from my men with 2 shooters walking rounds in on me every time I so much as breathed, the person who came for me was Dr. Morgan. She talked me into leaning out into the open. She asked me to bet my life on her rifle. And I did it, sir, because by then I understood there wasn't another soul on that mountain who could make that shot, and she made it. Both of them. Cleared my path, and I ran, and I'm standing in this tent right now because a woman I told to keep the coffee warm decided to save my worthless life anyway. His voice cracked on the last words, and he didn't try to hide it. I was wrong, sir, Vickers said. I have never in my life been more wrong about anyone. And I've got no business wearing this trident in the same unit as Cass Morgan if I don't say that out loud in front of everyone who heard me tear her down. So I'm saying it. I was wrong. She's twice the operator I'll ever be, and she did it without ever once raising her voice or asking for a thing. He turned then and he faced Cass directly across the tent, in front of them all. I'm sorry, Doc, he said, for all of it. I don't expect you to forgive it. I wouldn't. But you're owed those words in the same place I said the others, so there they are. Cass looked at him for a long moment, and what she felt standing there was not the vindication she might have imagined on all those mornings she'd been left at the gate. It was something quieter and heavier and more complicated than that, because she could see what it had cost him, this proud, hard man, to strip himself bare in front of everyone he led. And she knew something about pride and about the men her grandfather had served with, men exactly like Vickers. And she knew that an apology like this one was not cheap and was not small. Senior Chief, she said, and her voice carried in the silent tent. You want to know the truth? My grandfather served with 100 men like you. Loud, hard, sure they knew everything worth knowing. A pause. He used to say the loud ones were almost never the dangerous ones. But he also used to say something else. He said the loud ones who could admit when they were wrong out loud in front of everybody, with nothing to gain by it, those were the rarest men in any army, and the best ones. She let that sit. You just did the rare thing, Senior Chief. That's worth more than the apology. So we're square, and I'd be glad to serve with you. Vickers' throat worked. He nodded once sharp, a man who did not trust his voice, and he stepped back to the wall, and something in the whole tent seemed to exhale. But the colonel wasn't finished. There's more to this than one apology, he said. Lieutenant Mercer, you have something on the record as well, I believe. Mercer came forward, his arm in its sling, and he was worse off than Vickers, not physically, but in every other way, because Vickers had only been cruel, and Mercer had been the one who overruled her judgment and led his men into the funnel. He stood in front of the colonel, and he was not a man who looked like he'd slept. Sir, he said, 4 nights before the ambush in this tent, Dr. Morgan told me exactly what would happen. She stood right there. He pointed. She told me the enemy would let us walk into the southern draw that they'd open up from the eastern ridge with the sun in our eyes, that we wouldn't be able to see the shooters to fire back. She told me we'd be cut to pieces before we got a shot off. She had it mapped. She'd built a full-range card of the entire valley on her own initiative. And I overruled her, sir. I called it noted, and I took the southern draw anyway because... He stopped. His jaw tightened. Because she was the medic. Because I'd already decided what she was, and I couldn't hear anything that didn't fit it. And Delgado is dead because of that decision. That one's mine, sir. I wanted in the record that Dr. Morgan called it exactly 4 days out, and I didn't listen because of who I thought she was. The colonel was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Cass again. Dr. Morgan, is there anything you want to say to that? And here Cass thought was where she could have had her revenge, the clean and total kind, the kind she was owed. She could have stood there and let Mercer twist. She could have laid out point by point everything she'd said and everything he dismissed and watched him shrink. Every part of the last week entitled her to it. But she thought about Delgado, who was dead, and about the fact that no amount of Mercer's suffering would bring him back, and about her grandfather, who had killed more men than anyone she'd ever known, and had never once been cruel to a living soul off the battlefield because he'd understood something that took most people a lifetime to learn, if they learned it at all. That being right is not the same as being righteous. That the whole point of being the one who watches the one who's ready, the one who carries the weight, is so that you can spend it on something better than your own vindication. Lieutenant, she said, you made a bad call. You know you made a bad call. You'll know it every day for the rest of your life, and there's a man in the ground who won't get up because of it. I'm not going to stand here and tell you it's all right, because it isn't, and you'd know I was lying, and you deserve better than a lie. She paused. But I'm going to tell you the thing that matters more. You just stood up in front of your commander and your men, and you told the whole truth about the worst decision you ever made with nothing to gain and everything to lose. Most men never do that. Most men spend their whole lives dressing up their failures until they can live with them. You didn't. She looked at him steady. So here's what I need you to do, sir. I need you to take the man you were 4 nights ago, the one who couldn't hear a good idea because of who it came from. And I need you to bury him with Delgado, because that man gets people killed. But the man standing in front of me right now, the one who can admit he was wrong and mean it, that man might actually be worth following. So be that one. From here on, that's the only thing that makes any of this worth a damn. Mercer stared at her, and then slowly he straightened and something changed in his face. Some weight setting down and some spine coming up at the same time. Yes, doctor, he said quietly. I will. The colonel let the silence hold for a moment. Then he cleared his throat. For the record, he said, I've reviewed Dr. Morgan's file. There's nothing in it about any of this. No marksmanship qualification beyond the standard. No indication whatsoever that she was capable of what she did on that ridge. He looked at her, and there was open curiosity in it now and respect. Dr. Morgan, I have to ask, where does a Navy corpsman learn to make a 950-meter cold shot on a moving target under fire with a rifle she'd never fired before that morning? Because that is not a thing that people simply do. And so finally, in front of all of them, Cass told the part she'd never told anyone but Jonah Pike on a cold night at the edge of the base. My grandfather, sir, she said, he was a Marine Scout sniper. 2 wars, more confirmed kills than anyone in this tent has ever seen, and he never said a word about a single one of them. Her voice softened the way it always did when she spoke of him, which was almost never. My parents died when I was 7. He took me in, and he didn't know how to raise a little girl, so he raised me the only way he knew how. He put a rifle in my hands before I was tall enough to see over the kitchen counter. By the time I was 10, I could read wind off the grass. By 12, I could hold a position for 6 hours without moving. He used to blindfold me and hand me a rifle in pieces and make me name everything wrong with it before he'd let me eat. A ghost of a smile. I thought it was normal, sir. I thought every kid grew up that way. It wasn't until I was grown that I understood he was building me into something. He knew what he was. He knew what the world costs. And he decided his granddaughter was never going to be helpless in it. Not for one single day of her life. The tent was silent, and it was a different silence than before the silence of men reassembling their entire picture of a person. Why the medical corps? The colonel asked. With that background, you could have gone anywhere. Because he taught me the other thing too, sir, Cass said. He taught me that a man who only knows how to take life is only half a man. He wanted me to know how to give it back. So I went to medical school and I became a doctor, and I told myself the 2 halves were separate, the sniper and the healer. I kept them in different rooms. She paused and something moved behind her eyes, some understanding she'd only arrived at recently, maybe only on that ridge 4 days ago. I found out on that mountain they were never 2 things at all. Sometimes the most healing thing in the world is a well-placed shot. Sometimes killing is how you save. My grandfather knew that. It took me until that morning to understand it. Both halves are the same person, sir. They always were. I just needed a valley full of dying men to finally believe it. The colonel looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, and there was something almost like reverence in it. Your grandfather, he said, is he still living? No, sir, 6 years now. Then I'm sorry he didn't get to see this, the colonel said. Because I've been doing this 30 years, Dr. Morgan and I have never once seen anything like what you did on that ridge. He'd have been proud. I suspect he already knew he would be. Cass didn't trust herself to answer that, so she just nodded, and the colonel, who understood men and women better than most, let her have the moment without making her fill it. Then came the part that changed everything going forward. Effective immediately, the colonel said, I'm directing a change to your assignment with Lieutenant Mercer's full concurrence. He glanced at Mercer, who nodded firmly. You'll retain your role as unit medical officer, but you're also being designated as this element's long-range marksmanship instructor. Every operator on this team, and I do mean everyone, including the senior chief, is going to spend time on the range learning whatever you're willing to teach them. Because it has become abundantly clear to me that the most dangerous shooter on this mountain has been carrying a medical bag this whole time, and that is a resource this unit has been criminally wasting. He almost smiled. Any objection, Doctor? For the first time in the whole review, Cass Morgan was caught off guard. She'd expected a commendation, maybe, a line in a report. She had not expected to be handed the thing her grandfather had built her for and told to give it to others, to pass it on, to be finally and officially the one who teaches instead of the one who's hidden. "No, sir," she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. "No objection." "Good." The colonel turned to the rest of the tent. "One more thing. Petty Officer Pike, front and center." Jonah startled, then came forward, and the kid looked like he wanted to disappear. "Son," the colonel said, "I've read what Dr. Morgan wrote about you, and what the senior chief wrote and the lieutenant. You want to know what they all say?" He didn't wait. "They say that when that last enemy sniper had Dr. Morgan pinned and dead to rights, when she couldn't lift her head to find him without dying, it was you who spotted him." A 23-year-old with no sniper training talked the shooter of the year onto a target at 950 meters and did it in the 1 second she had before she'd have been killed. "Is that accurate, Dr. Morgan?" "It's accurate, sir," Cass said, and she looked at Jonah with something warm in her eyes. "I don't make that shot. He doesn't make that call. He was my eyes. He saved my life, and he saved every man in that draw by extension, because if I died on that post, the ridge falls and everybody down there dies with it. Pike held the whole thing together with nothing but his eyes and his nerve. He was the only one who ever looked at me and saw what I actually was, sir. Turns out he's got the same gift himself. He just never had anybody tell him." Jonah Pike's jaw trembled, and he locked it down hard, standing at attention, staring straight ahead. This young man who a week ago had been the least of them, and was now being told in front of everyone that he'd been the hinge the whole battle turned on. "You're being recognized for valor, son," the colonel said. "It'll come through channels, but I wanted you to hear it from me in front of the men you'll serve with for the rest of your career. You did a hard thing under the worst pressure there is, and you did it right, and people are alive because of it. Don't you ever let anybody tell you what you're worth. You already answered that question on that ridge." "Thank you, sir," Jonah managed barely. And then it was over the review, and the men filed out, and one by one, without making a show of it, they found ways to pass close to Cass Morgan on the way. A nod, a hand briefly on the shoulder, a quiet "doc" that carried a whole apology inside the single syllable. Ruiz, who'd wondered aloud why she never fought back, stopped in front of her and couldn't find words, and finally just put out his hand, and she shook it, and that was that. The men who'd called her just a medic filed past the woman who'd held the ridge, and not one of them called her that anymore, and not one of them ever would again. Vickers was the last to leave. He stopped in the tent flap, half in and half out, and he turned back. "Doc," he hesitated, "that coffee, the morning after." Cass looked at him. "I figured." "Yeah." He rubbed the back of his neck, this enormous hard man suddenly shy as a boy. "I didn't know how to—" There wasn't a way to say it. "So," he gestured vaguely helplessly. "The coffee." "I know, Senior Chief," Cass said gently. "It said plenty." He nodded, relieved, and started to go, and then stopped one more time. "Your grandfather," he said. "The scout sniper. What was his name? A man like that, I might have heard of him. Men in my line, we know the names." And Cass told him, and Daniel Vickers went very still, and the color drained from his weathered face, and he looked at her like she'd just told him something that rearranged the furniture in his skull. "That was your grandfather," he said slowly. "You knew the name." "Doc, everybody in my world knows that name." His voice had gone quiet and strange. "That man's a legend. They teach him. They teach the things he did." He shook his head slowly, and the rough, disbelieving laugh escaped him. "And I stood in a yard and told his granddaughter that carrying a rifle was a man's job." He laughed again at himself, bitter and amazed. "God almighty, no wonder you didn't argue. You were probably trying not to laugh in my face the whole time." "I never once wanted to laugh at you, Senior Chief," Cass said, and she meant it. "My grandfather taught me better than that. He'd have said you were exactly the kind of man worth having on your side of a firefight. Once you got your head right, and you got your head right faster than most, he'd have respected that." Vickers stood there a moment longer, absorbing it, the full shape of how wrong he'd been, and how graciously she was letting him climb back out of it. And then he did something Jonah Pike, watching from outside the tent, would never forget. This Senior Chief, this legend in his own right, this mountain of a man, came to attention in the tent flap and rendered Cass Morgan a slow, deliberate salute. It wasn't required. She wasn't his superior. It broke a dozen small rules of custom and rank. He did it anyway, because some things are bigger than rank. Cass returned it quiet and even, and Vickers dropped his hand, nodded once more, and walked out into the yard. And the thing between them that had started as contempt and passed through blood and shame was finally fully something else. Something that would last. Cass stood alone in the empty tent for a moment after they had all gone. She thought about the coffee and the salute and the colonel's words, and Jonah's trembling jaw, and Mercer burying the man he used to be, and Vickers' face when she said her grandfather's name. She thought about how none of it, not one single moment of it, was the thing she'd wanted on all those mornings at the gate. She hadn't wanted apologies. She hadn't wanted salutes or commendations or a room full of men reassembling their picture of her. She understood now what she'd wanted, the things she'd never quite been able to name. She'd wanted to be seen. Just once. Just to be looked at clearly by someone who could recognize what was actually there. And a scared young man named Jonah Pike had done it on a cold night at the edge of a base weeks ago, before any of it happened, before there was anything to prove. He'd looked at her range card and asked her who she really was. The rest of them had needed a valley full of dying men to finally see her. But she'd been seen, and that she realized standing alone in the tent where 4 nights ago they'd laughed her out of the room was the only thing she'd ever actually needed. The range at Firebase Anchor had never been used for much before Cass Morgan took it over. It was a stretch of open ground below the eastern wall, and mostly the men had used it to zero their weapons and then forget about it. But 3 days after the after-action review, at first light, the whole team assembled there, every operator, and they stood in a rough line and waited for a woman half their size to teach them how to do the thing they'd all believed only they could do. It was Vickers who called them to order. That was the first surprise. The senior chief who 3 weeks ago had thrown her bag in the dirt stood at the front of the formation and turned to Cass and said loud enough for all of them, "Doc's got the range. Whatever she says, that's the word. Anybody's got a problem with taking instruction from her can come see me about it after." He paused and the ghost of something hard and amused crossed his face. "I promise you it'll be a short conversation." Nobody had a problem with it. Cass stepped forward. She wasn't nervous exactly, but there was a strange weight in standing in front of these men as their teacher, because teaching was the one thing her grandfather had done for her and the one thing she'd never imagined doing for anyone else. She'd spent her whole life being the one who watched. Now she was going to be the one who was watched on purpose so that others could learn to see the way she saw. "All right," she said. "First thing, forget everything you think you know about what makes a shooter. It's not your arms. It's not your nerve. It's not how tough you are. I've watched every one of you, and you're all strong, and you're all brave, and not one of those things has ever put a round on target at 800 meters. A few of them shifted uncomfortable, and she let them. A rifle doesn't care how much you can bench. A rifle cares whether you can be still, whether you can be patient, whether you can be quiet in your body and in your head long enough to let the shot happen instead of forcing it. My grandfather used to say, the loud ones die and the watchful ones live. Well, out here, the same thing's true in miniature. The shooter who muscles it misses. The shooter who waits hits. So the first thing I'm going to teach you isn't how to shoot. It's how to be still. And I promise you, for men like you, it's going to be the hardest thing you've ever learned." She was right. It was. She started them on breathing before she ever let them touch a trigger. And Ruiz, who was fast and aggressive and used to solving problems by force, nearly came apart with frustration inside the first hour. "Doc, I'm just breathing. I've been breathing my whole life. When do we shoot?" "When you can put your heart rate under 60 and hold it there," Cass said calmly. "Because right now your pulse is bouncing your crosshair a foot off target at 400 meters and you can't even feel it. Breathe." He breathed, and he hated it. And 2 hours later, when she finally let him take a shot, and it landed exactly where she'd told him it would, 400 meters out dead center, he sat back on his heels and stared at the target and then stared at her. And something changed in his face, the specific wonder of a strong man discovering an entirely new kind of strength. "How?" he said. "How did you know it'd go right there?" "Because I know the wind and the drop, and I know your body's still now instead of fighting me," Cass said. "You didn't put that round on target, Ruiz. Stillness put it there. You just stopped getting in stillness's way." She almost smiled. "That's the whole secret. That's all your grandfather's rifle is. A tool for people who've learned to get out of their own way." Vickers took to it better than any of them, which surprised everyone but Cass. She'd expected the senior chief to struggle to fight it, to let his pride get in the way. Instead, he became her most serious student, silent and focused, absorbing everything. And one afternoon, she understood why. He came to the line, took his position, and before he settled behind the rifle, he said quietly, not looking at her, "My whole career, I've been the loud one, Doc. The one you said dies." He worked the bolt. "Reckon it's about time I learned the other way. The way that lives. The way that would have kept Delgado breathing if I'd had the sense to listen to you 4 nights before I needed you." Cass was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Delgado's not on you, Senior Chief. That's Mercer's to carry, and it's his to carry because he chose the draw, not because you were loud. Don't take a weight that isn't yours. There's enough real ones to go around." Vickers looked at her, and something eased in him just slightly. "You're a hard person to stay angry at, you know, that I wanted to hate you for being right about everything." "Most people do at first," Cass said. "My grandfather was right about everything too, and half the men who served with him wanted to strangle him for it. The other half owed him their lives." She nodded at the rifle. "Now breathe and get out of your own way." He did, and he hit the target at 600 meters clean, and he let out a slow breath and didn't say anything at all. And Cass understood that saying nothing was, for a man like Vickers, the loudest thing he could possibly do. Word came back about the wounded in pieces over those days. Mercer's shoulder was healing. He'd keep the arm. Keep his career, though. Something in him had gone permanently quieter after the draw, and Cass thought that was probably the best thing that could have happened to him. And then on the 5th day, the word she'd been waiting for and half afraid to hear. Theo Ramey was going to live. The message came through channels, and Fowler, the young radio man, sprinted the length of the base to bring it to her, personally breathless, grinning. Doc, Ramey. They got him stable at the field hospital, then flew him out to the big one, and he made it through surgery, and they're saying he's going to keep the leg. He's going to walk again. Doc, he's going to walk." The kid's voice cracked. "They said if that tourniquet hadn't been placed exactly right, exactly where it was, he'd have bled out before the bird ever got there. They said whoever did it saved his life." Cass took the message and read it twice, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 5 days finally let go. She thought about the gray in Theo Ramey's face in that draw, the specific gray of a man deciding whether to stay, and she thought about how she'd told him he had to live just to be embarrassed about needing the wire sitter, and she found she couldn't quite speak for a moment. "It wasn't just me," she managed finally. "Pike put that tourniquet on, under fire, before I ever got there. He put it high and tight exactly when it mattered. You tell him that, Fowler. You make sure Pike knows Ramey's alive because of his hands as much as mine." Fowler ran to tell it to him, and Cass watched from across the yard as the young radio man reached Jonah Pike and delivered the news, and she watched Jonah's face do the thing faces do when a weight you didn't know you were carrying finally lifts, and she watched him turn and look across the yard at her, and across all that distance. They just looked at each other, the two people who'd held a wounded man's life between them in the blood and the smoke, and neither of them needed to say a word. Some things pass between people who've done a thing like that together, and they don't need language. There was a letter later from Ramey himself once he could hold a pen. It was short because he wasn't a man of many words, and it was addressed to Doc, and it said only that he'd spent his whole career thinking he knew what a warrior looked like, and that he'd been wrong, and that the person who'd carried him out of that draw with a rifle on her back and his blood on her hands was more of a warrior than he'd ever be, and that he was sorry he'd ever stood in a yard and laughed. And at the bottom, in a shakier hand, like he'd added it after, it said, "You told me to stay alive, just to be embarrassed. Consider me embarrassed, Doc, and grateful for the rest of my life." Cass read that one alone, and she didn't show it to anybody, and she folded it and kept it, and that was the only thing from the whole ordeal she ever chose to keep. The days turned into a couple of weeks, and the strangest thing of all settled over Firebase Anchor, which was ordinariness. The men trained on the range every morning and got better slowly, humbly under Cass's quiet instruction. They ate together in the mess tent, and the war stories they told now included a new one told and retold, growing in the telling, the way all the best ones do about the doctor who held the ridge. And somewhere in there, without any single moment marking it, Cass Morgan stopped being an outsider they'd made room for and simply became one of them. An operator, an equal, a person whose word carried weight whose presence at a briefing was assumed, whose judgment nobody overruled anymore because of who she was, because they'd learned the hard way exactly who she was. They still called her Doc, but the word meant something completely different now. It had started as a way of putting her in a box, keeping her small, reminding her of her place. Now it was said the way you'd say a title of honor. Doc, the one who watches, the one who's ready, the one who held the ridge alone and then came down into the killing ground to save the men who doubted her with the same hands without ever once asking for thanks. Jonah Pike changed too in those weeks, and Cass watched it happen with something close to a mother's quiet pride, or maybe a grandfather's. The recognition for valor came through, made official, and it changed how the others treated him. But more than that, it changed how he treated himself. The young man who'd been the least of them, who'd been too afraid to speak up when they mocked her, stood taller now. He'd found out on that ridge what he was made of, and once a person finds that out, they can never quite unknow it. He started spending extra time on the range, and Cass taught him more than she taught the others because he had the eye, the real eye, the rare thing, and she knew a gift when she saw one, and she knew what it cost to have a gift, and no one to tell you it's real. You're going to be better than me someday, she told him one evening, the two of them alone on the range, as the light went long and gold. You've got something most shooters never have. You don't just see the target, you see the whole battlefield, the way it fits together. That's not something I can teach you. You either have it or you don't, and you have it. Jonah shook his head. I'll never make the shot you made. 950 meters, moving 1 second. You called that shot, Cass said. Don't you forget that. I pulled the trigger, but you found him. That's the harder half pike. Anybody with enough practice can learn to pull a trigger clean. Finding the thing nobody else can see, calling it in 1 second, oh, with a life on the line, that's the gift. And it's yours. She looked out at the valley, the same valley she'd read on her first night, the Eastern Ridge, the high point, the whole chessboard. My grandfather told me once that the best thing you can do in this life is find the one person who can carry what you carry and hand it to them before you're gone. He handed it to me. I think maybe I'm supposed to hand it to you. She was quiet for a moment. So learn everything I know, Pike, all of it. So that someday when there's a ridge that needs holding and I'm not there, there'll still be somebody on this earth who can see the way we see. Jonah didn't say anything for a long time. And then quietly, I will, Doc. I promise you I will. And Cass believed him because she'd looked at him clearly the way he'd once looked at her, and she saw exactly what was there. The orders came at the end of the third week. Cass was being reassigned, moved on to another posting the way it always went, the way the service moved people around like pieces on the very kind of board she read so well. It wasn't a surprise. Nothing about the service surprised her anymore. But it meant leaving and leaving. Firebase anchor meant something now that it wouldn't have meant 3 weeks ago, when she'd first walked through the gate to a chorus of laughter and a voice calling down that they'd sent a nurse. She packed light the way she always did. The rifle went back to the arms locker clean and true the way her grandfather had taught her to leave a weapon, because a weapon you leave dirty is a betrayal of the next person who trusts their life to it. She kept Ramey's letter. She kept her notebook, the one with the whole valley mapped in careful pencil. The one Jonah had found her writing that first night, and she thought she might keep mapping valleys in it for the rest of her life, because that was who she was and always had been. They came to see her off, all of them. That was the last surprise and the one that got closest to cracking the calm she wore like armor. The whole team assembled at the gate at dawn, the same gate where she'd been left behind so many mornings, and they were there not to watch her stay behind the wire, but to watch her go and to say goodbye and to say it right. Vickers spoke first because he'd earned the right to, and because the others deferred to him now in this, as in everything. He came forward, and he stood in front of her, and he was once again a man searching for words too big for his mouth. Doc, he said, I'm not going to make a speech. I already said the important part in the tent in front of everybody, and I meant every word of it, and I'll mean it till I die. He paused, but I wanted to say one more thing, just from me, just between us. He looked at her, this hard old warrior, and his eyes were wet, and he didn't care who saw. In 20 years, I've served with the best this country makes, the bravest, the most dangerous, and I have never once served with anybody like you. You didn't just save my life on that ridge. You showed me I'd been half blind my whole career, judging people by the wrong things, missing the real ones, because They didn't come in the package I expected. I'm going to spend whatever time I've got left trying to see people the way you see a battlefield. Really see them. That's what you gave me, Doc, and I'll never be able to pay it back. You already paid it, Cass said quietly. You stood up in that tent and told the truth when the easy thing was to stay quiet. That's the payment, Senior Chief. That's all I ever wanted from anybody. Just the truth said out loud. She put out her hand and he took it, and his enormous hand swallowed hers, and they shook, and it held for a long moment two people who'd traveled all the way from contempt to this. Take care of them, she said, and take care of yourself. The loud ones die. Remember, you've got a lot of good quiet left in you now. Use it. He nodded, unable to speak, and stepped back. Mercer came next, his arm out of the sling now, and he didn't say much because he was still a man learning to live with what he'd done, and Cass didn't make him say much. You called it Doc, he said simply. 4 nights out. You called all of it. I'll hear your voice in that tent every time I make a decision for the rest of my career. And I'll listen this time. I'll always listen from now on. That's the only thing I've got to give you, and it's yours. That's everything, Lieutenant, Cass said. A man who learns to listen is worth 10 who already know it all. Be that man. That's how you honor Delgado, every day for the rest of your life. You be the man who listens. Mercer's jaw tightened, and he nodded and stepped back, and Cass saw him decide right there to spend the rest of his life being that man, and she thought that maybe, just maybe that was worth something, even to Delgado wherever the good ones go. And then there was Jonah Pike last in line, the way he'd been first to see her, the young man who'd found her on the edge of the base on a cold first night and asked her who she really was. He stood in front of her, and his eyes were red, and he was trying so hard to hold it together. This kid who'd become a man on a ridge 3 weeks ago, and Cass felt her own armor crack just a little just for him. Doc, he started, and his voice broke immediately, and he stopped, and he tried again. You don't have to say it, Pike, Cass said gently. I already know. No. He shook his head, fierce, determined to get it out. No, I have to say it because you have to hear it, because you might not know. You might think, Doc, you spent this whole thing thinking nobody saw you, and I need you to know that from the first night, the very first night I saw you, I didn't know what I was seeing, but I saw it. And I was too scared to say anything when they were tearing you down, and I'll be ashamed of that for the rest of my life. But I saw you, Doc, before the ridge, before any of it, when there was nothing to prove and no reason to. I saw you. I just want you to leave here knowing that somebody saw you the whole time. And that was the thing that finally reached all the way through. Cass Morgan, who had held a ridge alone, under fire without her hand shaking, who had made a 950-meter shot on a moving target with her own life on the line, who had knelt in another man's blood and refused to let him die, felt her eyes sting for the first time in longer than she could remember. Because he'd named it, the one thing she'd never been able to name, the thing she'd wanted her whole life and never let herself ask for. To be seen. And a scared kid had given it to her before she'd earned it, before there was a single reason to back when everyone else looked at her and saw nothing at all. I know you did, Pike, she said, and her voice was thick. You want to know the truth. Out of everything that happened here, that's the part I'll keep. Not the shots, not the apologies, not the salute the senior chief gave me. You. The kid who looked at a range card on a cold night and asked me who I really was. She put both hands on his shoulders and looked at him hard so he'd remember it. You've got the gift, Jonah, the real one, not just the eye for a target, the eye for people. The eye that sees what's actually there instead of what everybody's decided to see. Don't you ever lose it. It's rarer than any shot I ever made, and it's worth more. You're going to see people your whole life that everybody else misses. When you do, you say something. You don't stay quiet the way you did that first week. You speak up. Because being seen by even one person at the right moment, that can save a life just as sure as any tourniquet. You saved mine before you ever put your hands on Ramey's leg. You saved it that first night when you looked at me and saw somebody real. Don't you ever forget the size of that. Jonah Pike couldn't answer. He just nodded, tears running freely now, and Cass pulled him into a brief, hard embrace, the closest thing to a family she'd had since her grandfather died. And then she let him go because holding on too long makes leaving harder, and she'd never been one to make things harder than they needed to be. She shouldered her bag. She looked at them one last time, the whole team assembled at the gate. The men who'd laughed at her 3 weeks ago and stood at attention for her now. She thought about the woman who'd walked through this gate that first morning, quiet and underestimated and invisible, carrying inside her a lifetime of training nobody could see and a grandfather's voice nobody could hear. She thought about how she hadn't changed at all, not one bit from that morning to this one. She was exactly the same person she'd always been. The only thing that had changed was that now they could see her, and that she understood at last was the whole story. She hadn't proved anything on that ridge. There'd been nothing to prove. She'd been the sniper and the healer and the one who watched and the one who was ready from the very first morning, from long before that, from a cold range where a hard old man had built her into something the world wasn't ready for. The ridge hadn't made her who she was. It had only finally forced everyone else to admit who she'd been all along. Cass Morgan turned and walked out through the gate of Firebase Anchor, not looking back, her steps steady and unhurried, the same quiet woman who'd walked in. And behind her, without a word, without an order, given every man on that team came to attention and held a salute until she disappeared over the rise and was gone. She didn't leave as someone who'd proven herself. She left as someone who had finally, after a lifetime of being unseen, been recognized for exactly who she always was. And that recognition, earned in silence and paid for in blood, was the one thing no one could ever take from her again.